My name is Cora Whitlock. I am 27 years old. And the last thing I heard before they dragged me from the schoolhouse was the word traitor spat like tobacco at my feet. I had lived in Elkhorn Crossing my entire life, taught their children to read, mended their linens when asked, never once raised my voice louder than necessary. But none of that mattered the moment they learned I was to marry Tamakai. One whisper turned to 10, and by the week's end, the preacher who once blessed my birthday cakes stood on his porch and watched as they tied my hands. They stripped my classroom bare, tore the books I had taught from, and painted the word whore across my chalkboard in red pig's blood. Tamakai had not even drawn his weapon when they circled him. He only tried to speak, hands raised, face calm, like peace could be bartered with decency alone. But decency died long before that day, and when the first blow landed, I screamed his name so loud it split something open in my chest that has never quite closed again. I do not know if he lived. I never saw his body. They came for me at dawn, shoved me into the dirt outside the sheriff's office, and laughed when I refused to beg. One of them, a boy I had once held through fever, ripped the brooch from my collar and called it payment for dishonor. My dress tore when they kicked me toward the edge of town. My lip split open when I fell against a fence post. No one stopped them. Not the mayor, not the preacher, not even the other women. They watched like I was a show put on to entertain the fear in their hearts. The last thing they did was tie my hands to a dead cottonwood at the trail's edge and tell me the coyotes would come before the night did. I remember the sky was cruelly beautiful then, all golden threads and pink fire, like it had no business being so peaceful when I was being left to rot. They took my shoes, my water, my name. They thought if they erased me from their sight, I would stop being a stain on their pride. But what they did not understand was that shame cannot live in a woman who knows love. And I knew love. Not the kind that asks to be hidden or softened, but the kind that stands in the open and dares to be seen. So I stood, bleeding and bound, and waited to see what the dark would make of me. I thought that might be the end, but it was only the beginning. Because before the coyotes, before the buzzards, before the cold could take me, I felt something small and warm tug at the hem of my ruined dress. And when I looked down, I saw the eyes of a bear cub staring up like it had been sent by God himself. The sun was high when they left me, its heat pressing down like a punishment from heaven, though I knew no heaven that would watch this and stay silent. My arms had gone numb where the ropes bit into my wrists, but the rest of me burned. The dress I wore was torn at the hem and soaked in sweat and blood, and every time I moved, even to breathe, it scraped like sandpaper against my skin. I remember thinking how quiet it was, except for the buzzards overhead, lazy in their circles, like they had all the time in the world to wait for me to stop twitching. I had never heard vultures so clearly before, their wings slicing through the air with a sound like an old book closing. The grass around the base of the tree was flattened from past use, and I wondered briefly if I was the first woman to be tied here, or just the one they chose to make an example of. My throat ached from screaming earlier, from calling Tamakai's name until it felt like my soul had cracked, and now there was nothing left but a dry rasp and a silent prayer. Not for rescue, not even for justice, but for the pain to stop long enough to think clearly. My lips split by the hour, and the heat made everything shimmer. I saw things I knew weren't real. My mother in her Sunday dress, waving from the porch, the old dog I'd buried when I was 10. Even Tamakai, standing in the tree line with that look he wore when he was trying to figure out how to explain something without scaring me. I whispered his name, not because I thought he'd answer, but because I didn't want the last word I said on this earth to belong to the men who'd tried to erase me. Time lost shape. I felt my knees buckle, though they were already on the ground. My head fell against my shoulder, My body was shutting down, slow and mean. I felt my heartbeat in my ears, growing softer, fainter, like a drum being carried away. I don't remember closing my eyes, just the dark creeping in at the edges like ink in water. And then, in the quiet between one breath and the next, I slipped away. Not into peace, not into some soft dream, but into the heavy weight of nothingness. I thought that was death. I thought I had gone. But when I opened my eyes again, cracked and stinging, there was something wet and warm nudging my leg, something alive and curious. I blinked through the haze and saw fur, soft and brown, and eyes wide as moons staring back at me. The bear cub was real, and for some reason I'll never understand, it had not come to feed or fear. It had come to stay. When I came to, it was not to the sound of angels or the hush of death like I had imagined, but to the strange tug of something small and persistent at the hem of my skirt. My vision blurred and cleared again in patches, like fog lifting from a broken mirror, and I thought at first it was the heat playing tricks again. But the tug came again, firmer now, and I looked down to see wide brown eyes staring up at me from a face that did not belong to any man or memory. It was a bear cub, no larger than a hound, with fur matted at the paws and a snout speckled with dust. Its breath came in little huffs, frightened but determined, and it didn't run when I moved. It stayed, pawing once more at my skirt like it had something to say. I tried to sit up, but my body screamed at the effort, shoulders stiff and back bruised from where the bark had pressed all night. My wrists burned raw where the rope had chafed, blood caking in crusted rings. The rope had snapped sometime during the night, maybe from my weight, maybe from time, or maybe from something else entirely. I didn't question the miracle. I just watched that cub turn and take 2 steps before looking back at me, expectant, as if to ask, "Well?" I dragged myself to my feet, half crawling at first, my legs shaking beneath me like a foal's peel. The cub moved slowly, patient, always just a few steps ahead, pausing every so often to make sure I was still behind. It didn't seem hurt, just young and lost, and maybe it saw the same in me. I followed, not because I understood, but because doing anything else felt like surrender. We passed under trees whose branches arched like the arms of saints, through bramble that tore at what was left of my dress until I heard it water, the sound of it rushing over stones, cool and constant. The cub padded to the edge of a shallow stream, dipping its head to drink, then looked at me again. I fell to my knees, hands shaking as I reached the water, cupping it in trembling palms. It tasted like rain and roots and something older than pain. I drank until my body stopped trembling. I washed the blood from my wrists, watched it swirl away downstream like a broken promise. The cub stayed nearby, sitting on its haunches, watching. I still didn't know why it had come, or why it had pulled at me with such urgency. Maybe it was just a beast acting on instinct. Or maybe, in some twisted way, the world balances its cruelties with odd mercies, and this small creature was the only kindness left on this side of the woods. I did not speak to it, but I whispered thank you, just in case it understood. Night came down like a blanket soaked in ink, heavy and muffling, and every shadow in the woods stretched long and thin like it had something to hide. My legs had long since given out, and the raw ache in my wrists pulsed with every heartbeat. The cub was gone, vanished into the thick brush, like it had only been meant to guide me that far, and I was too weak to mourn its absence. The wind shifted with a hush that felt less like weather and more like breath held in waiting. I felt them before I saw them, eyes in the trees, silent and patient. Not animals, not the kind that hunt for hunger, the kind that watch and weigh. My body shivered, not from cold, but from the feeling that I had stepped into a space not meant for me, that I had trespassed beyond the line where most white folk turned back. I stumbled forward anyway, my vision weaving, until the trees broke and the faint flicker of firelight danced just ahead. I barely made it to the edge of the clearing before my knees buckled and the world swam sideways. Faces appeared above me, not cruel or frightened like those in town, but cautious. They spoke words I couldn't hold on to, their syllables curling around my ears like river mist. I didn't fight when hands lifted me. I didn't flinch when a ladle of warm broth was pressed to my cracked lips. The liquid tasted of bone and root, and something deeper, something old. My body accepted it before my mind did. I was wrapped in thick furs, the smell of smoke and cedar clinging to every fold, and somewhere in the quiet hum of voices I didn't understand, I felt the thread of a lullaby being hummed low. Still, no one said his name. No one spoke of Tamakai, and I, in turn, said nothing. My throat held the weight of his name like it was made of stone. I lay still in the circle of warmth, trying to make sense of the way the firelight flickered in their eyes. Men, women, even children, watched me not with hate, but with something sharper than pity and softer than judgment, like they had seen white cruelty before and were measuring me against its echo. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask if he was here, if he was alive, if he still wore the necklace I had woven from horsehair and wild berries the night before we were torn apart. But my body needed rest more than answers, and my heart could not bear the wrong one. So I closed my eyes, letting the forest murmur to itself, letting their fire warm bones that had not felt safe in days. And somewhere beyond the edge of sleep, I wondered if Tamakai had seen the same flames flicker through the branches, or if the woods had swallowed him whole long before they ever laid their hands on me. I woke to heat, but not the blistering kind that scalds the skin like the sun on the day they tied me to that tree. This was different. This heat sank in slow and steady, like fingers easing into bone to push out the pain. My head was thick with steam and the smell of cedar, sage, and something bitter I couldn't name. The walls around me weren't walls at all, just curved branches wrapped in hides, trembling slightly with the breath of the fire at the center. I was lying on woven mats, my dress replaced with soft buckskin, my arms wrapped in poultices that clung to the places where the rope had burned. A woman sat beside me, older than anyone I had seen in Elkhorn Crossing, her gray braids resting against her chest like soft ropes of smoke themselves. She moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen too many wounds and had learned to tend them without waiting for thanks. Her hands were warm, her eyes sharp but kind, and when I tried to sit up, she pressed her palm to my shoulder and said, "Not yet." I asked her name, and she told me it was Sata, her voice like gravel and rain. I asked if I was safe, and she said yes. Then I asked about Tamakai. Her hands froze, just for a breath, but it was enough. I watched the air go still around her, as if the fire itself held its breath. She didn't answer right away. She pulled the hide blanket up around me, adjusted the herbs steaming in the bowl near my head, and only when I asked again, softer this time, did she speak. "He never came back," she said, eyes not meeting mine. "He went to find you, to stop them, but he didn't return." My throat closed. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say no, that couldn't be, that he was too strong, too fast, that he promised me under the cottonwood tree that he would always come back, but I couldn't form the words. My mouth went dry as the desert. "His body?" I managed. Sakta shook her head. "We searched for days, but the trail, it ended in blood and silence." I curled into myself then, pulled my knees to my chest like I had as a child when the storms came too loud and too sudden. My wrists ached, my back burned, and now this, the worst pain of all, not knowing. Sakta didn't speak again. She let me cry. She let me shake. She placed a clay bowl of water beside me and left. And I lay there in the smoke and the dim red glow, counting the scars on my hands like they were the only proof left that I had ever been touched by love at all. The morning of the ceremony was quiet in the way only grief can make it. The kind of quiet that settles in your chest like damp ash, where even the birds seem too respectful to sing. I wore a plain wrap of deer hide that Sata had sewn with her own hands, and though it fit awkward across my shoulders, I was grateful for it. They gathered in a half circle around the fire pit, the tribe who had every reason to turn me away, and yet chose not to. Tamakai's uncle placed a smooth river stone in my palms, freshly washed and warm from the Sunday. A carving knife was handed to me without words. It was old, its handle worn to the shape of many fingers before mine, and for a moment I simply held it, trembling. I had never carved anything before. Never even held a knife for this purpose. But I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I pressed the tip against the stone and began. Each scrape of the blade was a memory. The way he tucked my hair behind my ear without asking. The quiet way he stood behind me at town meetings, so I could speak without fear. The night he whispered, he had no tribe word for wife, strong enough for what I was to him, so he simply called me Heart. I carved his name in their tongue first, then mine, side by side. I did not speak when I was finished. I just stood there, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, the stone cradled in both hands like something sacred. When I laid it down on the edge of their burial mound, my tears came without warning. Not just for him, but for the girl who'd believed Elkhorn Crossing could be saved. For the teacher who thought her voice was enough. For the fiancé who waited too long to run, that girl was gone too. Buried under hate and fire, and the weight of ropes that still burned my wrists in dreams. When I finally turned back, the elder with the hawk feather braid nodded once. It was enough. I was allowed to stay. No title, no promises. Just a place to sleep, work to do, and people who watched me not with suspicion but with caution. I chopped wood for the fires, carried water from the stream, peeled roots with the other women, and sat quietly when they spoke, memorizing each phrase until the words came naturally. I said little. I listened much. My hands blistered. My back ached. But the ache was honest. The sweat on my skin meant something. I was not healing, not yet. But I was building something. Not a life, exactly. More like a foundation. And every time I passed that little mound where the stone now sat, I whispered Tamakai's name under my breath. Not so he would hear me, but so I would never forget how much had been taken from both of us. 1 year had passed, though it felt like a lifetime folded neatly inside itself. I returned to Elkhorn Crossing in the dead of morning, before the sun had burned the mist off the church steeple, before the bakery's windows glowed with warmth and yeast. I wore a rough-woven cloak dyed in bark and smoke, pulled low over my eyes. My hair, once kept in a schoolmarm's tidy bun, now hung long in a braid down my back, streaked with copper from the sun and wind. The horse I rode was not my own, but a gift from Sata, who said only that the animal knew sorrow and wouldn't spook at silence. No one looked at me twice as I passed through town, not right away. The general store was unchanged, its windows dusty, the bell above the door still crooked from that summer storm long ago. The saloon smelled of spilled whiskey and rot. Children darted between barrels in the alley, laughing like nothing terrible had ever happened here. I dismounted by the well, tying my reins loosely and walking as if I had every right to be there. No one stopped me, not yet. Grief carves a woman's face into something unfamiliar, and maybe that was my blessing. Or maybe people just prefer not to look too closely at ghosts. I stood outside the blacksmith's for a full hour, watching the first man, Garrett Kane. He was older now, slower, his right hand favoring the hammer like it weighed more than it used to. I saw him spit, laugh, scratch his beard, and drink from a chipped tin cup. Not once did he glance my way. Not once did he recall the way he laughed when the rope was tied around my wrists. I moved next to the livery, where the second man, Will Dobbins, fed horses with the same cruel snap of the reins I remembered. He limped now, left knee stiff. The third took longer. I found Thomas Griggs behind the chapel, hauling crates of hymnals like they were coal. He looked smaller than I remembered, not in stature but in presence. Like the years had shrunk his importance in the world. I didn't approach. I didn't speak. I simply watched, measured, remembered. The cloak kept the stares off me, but not the heat bubbling under my ribs. I didn't come with guns or fury. That would have been too easy. I came with truth, with time, with a memory sharper than any blade. When I walked past the schoolhouse I once tended, its windows now cracked and its shutters peeling, I paused just long enough to press my hand to the rail. My name wasn't spoken aloud that day, but I was there, and I would remain, because justice, like grief, waits quietly until the world is ready to face it, and I had waited long enough. It started with a whisper in the grass, the kind that slithers unnoticed until it bites. Garrett Kane was the first to go, found face down in the scrub behind the smithy with his jaw swollen shut and his eyes wide like he'd seen something that didn't belong to this world. They said it was a rattler, but no one heard a rattle. No one saw the coils. Just Garrett, bloated and blue, one boot off and the other twisted backward like his body tried to run and his soul said no. They buried him without a sermon. The preacher said a man's mouth should not bless what his hands had ruined. A week later, Will Dobbins woke to smoke choking his lungs and flames licking the rafters of his barn. He stumbled out, screaming like a pig stuck on a fence post, barefoot and wild-eyed, and though the fire took the roof and the hay, it was the ledger he cried for. His debts were thick in that book. His sins thicker. He ran to the sheriff with ash on his skin and begged for protection, but the sheriff only scratched his chin and asked if Will had locked his doors. The wind that day carried the scent of cedar and scorched ink. And then there was Thomas Griggs. He thought himself untouched, maybe even chosen, like God had forgotten what he'd done behind the chapel all those months ago. But one morning, just as the fog lifted off the schoolyard, he found it. His name carved into the wood of the schoolhouse rail, not with a knife, but with something deeper, something primal. 3 letters in raw grooves, and beside them, the unmistakable imprint of a bear's claw. Not drawn, not scratched, but pressed, like the animal itself had marked him. He stood staring at it for near an hour, trembling like a boy caught in the cellar. He asked the preacher what it meant, but the preacher only looked toward the trees and said, "Sometimes the earth speaks when we won't." No one said my name, not once. But I saw the way the townsfolk looked at each other now, like shadows had started walking behind them. I watched from the edge of the trees, the cloak heavy on my shoulders, and the weight of the past tucked in every step I took. Sachta once told me that justice was not always a blade. Sometimes it was the sound of wind through a ruined barn, or the hush of feet near a forgotten grave. I hadn't come to kill. I had come to reckon, quietly, deeply, the way roots break stone. And as I moved through the edges of their lives like dusk over a tired town, I knew they finally understood. I had not died. I had become something they couldn't name. And that, more than vengeance, would keep them looking over their shoulders for the rest of their lives. He came at dusk, when the trees looked like ghosts, and the air smelled of moss and memory. I heard the crunch of leaves long before I saw him, the way a deer knows the shape of a hunter's footsteps. But he came without malice, without a badge, without even a hat to hide behind. Deputy Eli Vance, tall and younger than I remembered, with the kind of face that always looked like it was waiting for permission. He stood just beyond the firelight, holding his rifle in both hands like it might break in two. I didn't speak first. I wanted to see if his mouth still worked when not curled around someone else's orders. He cleared his throat and said my name like a prayer half forgotten. Cora. Not miss, not ma'am, not teacher, just the name they buried in shame a year ago. I didn't nod. I didn't flinch. I waited. He stepped forward, his voice shaking like a leaf in wind. He told me he hadn't wanted to be part of it, not really. That when they dragged me from the classroom and spit on my dress, he'd kept his hands in his pockets like that somehow made him innocent. Said he told Sheriff Mullen it wasn't right, that a woman shouldn't be punished for loving a man with darker skin. But when the ropes were tied and the mob howled like dogs, he'd done nothing, nothing but watch. And for that, he said, he had not slept a full night since. He offered me his rifle then, like penance could be passed from one set of hands to another. I didn't touch it. I just stared at him, until his shoulders sank and his eyes filled with something too raw to name. I told him I didn't need a weapon, that I wasn't carving names for the sake of blood. That truth, when spoken out loud, could split a town cleaner than any bullet. I told him if he meant to do right, then let the truth come from his mouth and not just his tears. Let him walk into Elkhorn Crossing and say what he saw, what he failed to stop, and who still walks free with blood on their breath. I told him courage wasn't pulling a trigger. It was standing in front of the very men you feared and refusing to lie for them one more time. He didn't speak again. Just placed the rifle gently against the tree and walked back the way he came, boots slow, like each step dragged a piece of him through the mud. I didn't follow. I had no need. Whether he spoke or not, the woods had already heard his confession, and so had I. In that clearing of flickering light and brittle leaves, I saw the first man in that town begin to rise from the muck of his cowardice. Not a hero, just a witness, learning what it costs to carry silence. The first snow fell before the leaves had even finished dying, blanketing Elkhorn Crossing in a hush that felt like a warning rather than a gift. It came sudden and thick, turning the streets into ghost paths and the roofs into burial mounds. I watched from the edge of the tree line, the place where the pine needles stayed green no matter what the sky did, and I listened to the town breathe uneasy beneath its frozen quilt. They had started whispering again, not just behind closed doors, but out loud, in bakeries and barber shops, in church pews and feed stores. They called me the woman in the woods, said I moved like smoke and left signs where guilt lived. One boy, no older than 6, found a small bear doll on his doorstep one morning, woven from cedar bark and twine, with a single white bead for an eye. His mother screamed. His father slapped the door shut so hard the hinges rattled. But the boy smiled, said the doll smelled like cinnamon and pine, and reminded him of someone who used to read stories and braid ribbons into little girls' hair. I had made dozens of those dolls, each one stitched with quiet care, handed out in my classroom on days when the world felt too heavy. I hadn't made one since the night I was dragged from my desk, my ink-stained fingers gripping the edge of the chalkboard. The mothers began to worry then. Not because of what I might do, but because of what their children remembered. Memory, after all, is the one thing you cannot whip out of a child. One little girl cried for the teacher who taught her to count on acorns and whisper songs to bees. Another refused to eat her supper unless her father admitted the woman they called wicked once gave her mittens when her hands turned blue. I didn't go near the schoolhouse. I didn't need to. Children see through masks, even the ones stitched with law and sewn with shame. The snow thickened by the week, and still they spoke of me. Some claimed they saw a shadow moving between the trees. Others swore they found claw marks on their barns. But nothing was ever stolen. No harm ever came, just tokens, reminders. That justice is not always loud. That a woman cast out is not the same as a woman broken. And in the silence of snowflakes and memory, the town began to choke on its own legend. I had become the shape of consequence, the ghost of their cruelty wrapped in a red scarf and remembered by the smallest hearts. And with every flake that fell, they understood more clearly that what they tried to bury had taken root instead. Not in vengeance, but in truth. And that truth was already growing strong beneath the snow. I heard about it before the sun had even warmed the frost off the church steps. Word travels faster in towns gripped by guilt, where every whisper echoes like a footstep in a dry chapel. Sata, the elder who had once wrapped my wounds in silence and boiled roots until they turned pain into sleep, had walked straight into Elkhorn Crossing, with a pack full of trade goods, and the calm of someone who did not fear men puffed up by titles. She came with jars of honey, cured meat, dyed cloth, and bundles of dried herbs that could soothe lungs or break fevers, depending on how you boiled them. The mayor, a fleshy man with fingers always curled like he expected applause, laughed in her face, called her a wandering savage, asked her if she had come to trade bones. Sakta didn't flinch, didn't speak. She just laid her bundle near the church door and left one thing behind, carefully placed behind the altar where only the preacher would find it. A single braid of my hair, still bound in red thread, still stained at the tip with the rusted memory of rope and tree bark. That braid had been cut from my head the day they dragged me out. I remember the sound of the blade, not sharp enough, tearing more than slicing, the heat of blood running down my neck like shame. I had buried it in a pouch beneath the roots of the cottonwood tree beyond the smoke lodge, certain it was the last piece of the girl I had been. Sata must have dug it up in silence and walked it into town like a relic. The preacher refused to touch it, not out of superstition, but because something in his belly knew that touching it meant seeing what had been done. They say he just stared at it for a long time, hands trembling, lips dry, until he turned and vomited behind the pulpit. The braid stayed there all day, untouched. By dusk, someone had laid a cloth over it. By morning, it was gone, but not forgotten. The next Sunday, half the pews sat empty. Mothers kept their daughters home. Fathers shifted uneasily when the preacher tried to speak of repentance, but could not say for what. The church bell rang, but no one listened. Sata never looked back as she rode out, her horse slow and sure-footed, her silence louder than any sermon. I watched from the ridge above the western trail. The braid I had once surrendered now returned like a name written in ash and iron. I touched the stump where my hair had once been thick and long, and for the first time in a long time I smiled. Not because they feared me, but because they remembered. Because truth, once planted, does not stay buried. It rises, it walks, and sometimes it wears braids. The morning I walked into the churchyard, the wind was so still it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. I wore no cloak, no hood, nothing to hide who I was. My boots were caked with red soil from the ridge trail, and my hands, though clean, still held the tremble of old fire. The widows were already gathered there, sitting stiff-backed on the old benches beneath the juniper trees that marked the graves of their husbands, though not one of them had a proper stone. They looked up when I arrived. 3 women dressed in dark fabric sewn by quiet hands, eyes sharpened not by hatred but by absence. They knew who I was. Not because I looked like the girl they left for dead, but because I didn't. There's a heaviness you carry when you've been peeled back to the bone and still had breath left to offer. I carried it like armor. I didn't speak, didn't bow, didn't pretend to offer condolences. I just walked up and set something in each of their laps. Small, worn brass compasses, each one cracked across the face, but still pointing north like they were stubborn about truth. I had etched one word on the back of each with my own knife, carved so deep the blades had dulled by the third. Truth. That was all. I didn't explain where I found them, though I knew they recognized the objects. Every man had carried one. Gifts from the same supplier, used to track herds, to mark stolen lands, to call themselves explorers in places they did not belong. One had been clenched in a cold dead hand, another pried from the ashes of a barn still reeking of smoke, the last buried under a floorboard behind the schoolhouse, where I had once taught lessons to children who now watched me from behind their mother's skirts. The widows didn't scream. One of them cried, but the kind of crying you do when something inside you splits, not out of grief, but from the slow leak of knowing you've lied to yourself too long. I looked each woman in the eye and waited. Not for apology, not for rage, just to see if any of them would shatter beneath the weight of what they had refused to name. None of them did, but none of them looked away either. That was enough. I turned and walked out of the yard. The wind rising behind me like the breath of a mountain finally exhaled. There would be no court, no gallows, no gallant last words. Just 3 women holding the broken tools of men who used them to navigate away from their own decency. A trial with no jury, no judge, only memory. And me, the last witness. It had been nearly 7 winters since the wind last carried my name through Elkhorn Crossing, and I thought maybe the land had swallowed the memory whole. But on a morning laced with thaw and wood smoke, a bear cub grown now, thick with muscle and winter fur, wandered into the center of town like it belonged. It wasn't the same one. I knew that. The first had long since returned to the woods, or the spirit world, but this one walked with the same deliberate steps, the same calm eyes that saw more than they should. No one shot it, no rifles lifted. No boys with rocks, no barking dogs. It came in through the eastern path near the cottonwoods, the one that led past the old well I had stood beside every afternoon, teaching little mouths how to sound out words that had never been meant for them. I taught them patience, taught them how to spell dignity before they could even understand it. The cub paused at the well, sniffed the stones, pressed one heavy paw against the wood bucket like it remembered something or someone. I watched from the ridge just above the tannery, where the trees still held their leaves longer than they should. The townspeople stood frozen. Old Mrs. Rayner clutched her shawl tight, whispering something to the pastor. The butcher's boy dropped his knife. Children peeked from behind windows with wide eyes, hushed by fathers who remembered the last time silence preceded a reckoning. The cub made one slow circle around the well, then another, then stopped. Its breath steamed in the air like smoke signals from another time. A man coughed, a horse snorted, but still no one moved. It looked up once toward the schoolhouse, now shuddered for lack of a teacher brave enough to stay. Then, without sound or struggle, it turned and walked back into the forest. No one followed. Not even the dogs. The stillness held long after it disappeared, as though the whole town waited to see if it had left something behind. And maybe it had. Not a threat, not a message, just a reminder of what they'd done, of who they tried to bury, of the silence that had not been consent. I felt my breath return only when the last twig snapped under its retreating paws. Elkhorn Crossing had changed since that day, but not enough. You can whitewash walls, rename streets, burn records, but the land remembers. The animals remember. And sometimes, if the wind is just right, so do the people. I turned away before the church bell rang, my boots pressing new prints into the softened earth, not waiting to see if anyone would follow. They never did, not really. But they watched, and for now, that was enough. They built it quiet, like they were afraid if they made too much noise, the ghost of their guilt might wake up and change its mind. No brass bands, no ribbon cutting, just sweat and lumber and the soft thud of hammers striking nails into redemption. I didn't ask for it, never would have. But still, one morning, just after the first frost, I rode by and there it stood. Fresh pine boards glowing in the weak sunlight like bones bleached clean. The roof slanted a little too sharp, the windows square but kind, and over the door, carved into a hand-sanded plank, the words, "The Cora Whitlock School for All Children." I stared at that name so long I forgot it was mine. It looked strange up there, like a song sung back to you in a voice you hadn't heard in years. I dismounted and ran my fingers across the grooves, the W still a little splintered where the chisel must have caught, but it was honest work, not fancy, just real. Inside, the desks were all the same size, none smaller for the Indian children like they used to be. No separated rows, no back doors. Just a square stove, a blackboard, and light enough through the windows to read without squinting. They even used some of the old timber from the well where I used to teach, back before they decided I wasn't fit to teach anything but shame. That day, I sat in the front row like one of my old students might, and I imagined all their faces again, rowdy and curious, dirt on their hands and hunger in their eyes. Not hunger for food, but for space to belong. The kind you can't fake with charity. I found a small slate tucked under the first desk, already scratched with the alphabet in a child's crooked hand. I traced the letters and smiled, because somewhere between the forest and the fire, between being tied to a tree and carving Tamakai's name into stone, I forgot that I ever wanted to teach again. But standing there, in the school that bore my name not as a scar, but as a banner, I remembered, not the pain, not the burning, but the reason I ever opened my mouth to speak in the first place. The door creaked open behind me, and a girl with braids stepped in, brown-skinned, barefoot, and holding a book tight like it might fly away. She didn't speak, just sat across from me, quiet and proud. I didn't ask her name, didn't need to. She was mine in the way all students are yours when you see yourself in them. We sat there for a while, breathing the same dust, warming our hands near the same iron stove, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had come home to something that had been waiting for me all along. They say the wind changes when it passes the tree line, like it remembers, like it slows for a breath, or a bow, or something older than either. I've felt it myself, that hush that settles in the bones just before the shadows stretch long and the birds fall silent. The children say they've seen her, a figure at the edge where pine meets prairie, where the last light brushes the ground like a whisper. They say she wears a gray cloak and moves like smoke, her hand out, her eyes soft but knowing. I reckon I believe them. Not because I've seen her myself, but because I've known her was her, and maybe still am, in the way stories never really let you go once they take root. Beneath the apricot tree I planted all those years ago, the one whose blossoms first bloomed when my body had nothing left to give but memory, there's a patch of ground no one disturbs, no marker, no name. Just the roots that drink from what I left behind, and the fruit that keeps coming back year after year, even in drought. The town doesn't speak of me loud, but they don't spit either. The children are taught my name now, not in warnings but in reverence. They call me teacher, they call me protector, they call me ancestor when the fires are low and the winds rattle the shutters. The mothers tell their daughters about the school, about the claw carved into the schoolhouse beam, and about the time a bear cub followed a dying woman to water because something in the world still knew mercy. The men, the ones who came after, they nod when they pass the tree. Some tip their hats, some leave tokens. I found a ribbon once, the kind I used to tie into my braid, folded neat beneath a stone. I found a page torn from a primer book, letters written in a hand that trembled but tried. And once, just once, I found a child's drawing, all stick limbs and two big eyes, labeled her. Maybe it was me, maybe it was the girl who found shelter after me. Either way, the line continues. The wind carries it, the ground remembers it. And in the hush before night fully falls, you can almost hear her laugh soft, like a creek that never dried up, or a memory that refused to die. They used to call me Indian lover like it was a curse, like it was something shameful to survive for. But now, when the wind bends through the trees and the little ones clutch their blankets tighter and whisper about the woman who watches the woods, no one mocks her name. No one dares. Because some names stop being insults and start being legends. And some women, even when forgotten, become the breath in the wind that tells you which way to run when the world gets cruel again.